So today we're going to be talking about chapter 23, and that's the beginning of the 20th century crisis, talking about war, talking about revolutions, particularly the First World War, as well as the Bolshevik Revolution, or the beginnings of communism in Russia. Now first, I want to try to explain how the First World War began. And this is a tricky subject because there's no one true cause. I mean, on one hand, you have the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was grandson to the ruler of Austria. But really, he was one of just over a dozen different monarchs or different leaders of nations that had been killed at around the same decade. So what makes him so special? Well, first off, Europe had become divided. It had always been a divided collection of states, but following the Napoleonic Wars and the treaties which resolved them, there had always been an understanding that power would not be allowed to centralize out of fear of domination. You know, is the First World War really the First World War? Well, you could just as plainly argue that the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, which bled over to the Western Hemisphere, was actually the First World War. You could also argue that the Napoleonic Wars were a part of this ongoing conflict. But the point is that after those wars, power was not supposed to be centralized in one place. There was supposed to be a balance of power between the states. But by the beginning of the 20th century, there were two great alliances. One called the Allied Powers. The main three nations you need to know are Russia, Great Britain, and France, but there were quite a few. Particularly among these is a little ally of Russia called Serbia, which we'll come back to. The other set of alliance is known as the Central Powers, and that is Germany, the Austria-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, two out of those three nations no longer exist. And so, one of the underlying causes, or we call them the indirect causes of the First World War, is this alliance system. Second of the underlying causes is more of a cultural phenomenon, and that is nationalism. And going back to John Locke's idea of the self-determination of people, that you have the right to identify with the nation that you feel most closely resembles your ethnicity and your beliefs, both politically and religious. And this concept of nationalism led to quite a few revolutions, most famous for us being the American Revolution, where we had lived apart from Britain for a long enough time that we no longer saw ourselves as British. And after a period of time, we, or at least the elites, the wealthy, those with influence, felt it was time that we declared independence. Next, this was, for many, a very poor time, especially for countries like Russia, who had been living under the sway of the Tsar, a ruling family, for many hundreds of years. The people of Europe had been plagued by constant warfare, by high taxes, and many were living in a state of poverty. And impoverished peoples tend to cause political uprisings. And so there was a great fear of Karl Marx's ideas becoming realized in many nations throughout Europe. Next is the growing size of nations' militaries. conscription, that is, the forced entry into the military, had been going on for quite some time. Nations had been building up militaries. Germany had been preparing for war for decades prior to the First World War. Plans were laid for the mobilization of armed forces for the greatest efficiency in conquest. Germany's famous plan for mobilization was called the Schlieffen Plan, named after Max von Schlieffen, a German general. He had even calculated the railroad schedules for how to get troops to France within the window of time necessary to conquer France in a month. The plan involved holding off Russia. All this was done prior to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And so here we're looking at the two great alliances. You've got the red being Britain, France, and Russia, known as the Allied powers, and then the purple here, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, what was once known as the Ottoman Empire, as the Central Powers. Here we see evidence of mobilization. Now this is really, that's in Kosovo, UN peacekeeping troops, and this is actually Nazi troops prior to the Second World War. But the point is, people were beginning to see lots of soldiers in the streets. I'm sure you recognize this face. This is the face of Adolf Hitler among the German crowds preparing to sign up for the German military in the First World War. Somebody decided to play Where's Waldo and find him. Now, how did the war actually begin? Europe at this time was seen as a powder keg. Like the powder keg that exploded in the warship the Maine, which blew up off Havana Harbor in Cuba in 1898. The powder had been stored incorrectly without proper ventilation, allowing the slightest spark, even of static electricity, could cause the entire ship to blow. And so Europe at this time was called a powder keg. That the conditions were ripe for world war. Now the Austria-Hungarian Empire had conquered territory to the south, a nation known as Serbia. Now, Serbia is within an area of what was formerly Greece, or the Macedonian Empire. Serbia is ethnically distinct from Austria. So they did not identify as Austrians. They do not speak German. They are of a different skin tone and consider themselves different than Austrians. Yet they were being ruled by Austrians. So this idea of nationalism. Now, when Franz Ferdinand, grandson of Joseph Conrad, the great ruler of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, was sent to Sarajevo, the capital city of Austria, he was on a parade, a great big tour, a display of Austrian power in this colony. And he was murdered by a member of an organization known as the Black Hand. They were a Serbian nationalist group, and they had stationed themselves on various street corners, each swearing that given the opportunity they would assassinate this man. So it was certainly part of a conspiracy. Now, when Franz Ferdinand was shot, and actually you were looking at a picture of he and his wife just moments before they were assassinated. But when he was assassinated, Austria declared a series of ultimatums. That Serbia must stand down, that they must allow pursuit of the Black Hand terrorist organization within their borders, or they must face war with the Austria-Hungarian Empire. So this was seen as a terrorist action, and troops were sent to Serbia as a result. So again, here we're looking at Franz Ferdinand just moments before he was shot and killed. Here's where it gets complicated. And this is known as the July Crisis of 1914. Austria declares its ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia complies with most of Austria's demands, yet contacts Russia, their ally, to ask for the fulfillment of their promise in the event of war. And was literally able to call Russia on the phone. Telephones had been recently invented. One could make the argument that what if they didn't have telephones or telegraphs? What if communication had not been instantaneous at this time? Would the mere speed and slowness of the old methods of communication had allowed these nations time to cool down? Because you see, when Serbia called when Serbia called Russia, and then Russia called Britain to make sure they still had their back, all this communication was happening rather quickly. And so Austria declared war against Serbia. In turn, Russia declared war against Austria. And because of this tangled web of alliances, what really should have been a localized conflict between parent country and colony became a global conflict. Now, at this point, were it not for imperialism, you could argue it's just a continental affair. Just one of Europe's long chain of wars, be it the 30 Years' War, the War of the Roses, the 7 Years' War, etc. But what makes this one unique is that each of these European powers had colonial possessions, and that subjects from these colonies would be pulled into the conflict. On August 3rd, less than a month after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Germany was putting the Schlieffen Plan into place. Now, the plan, as sophisticated as it was, required a bit of a gamble to pull it off. You see, Germany contacted Belgium. Belgium was created as a neutral country. It's the most logical point of contact between France and Germany. It's where the easiest travel is between the countries, is going through Belgium. Because you have the Ardennes forest in France, too thick and mountainous an area for heavily armored troops to get through. And then further to the south you have the Alps. And so the most logical place for German advance is through Belgium. Because France was no fool. I mean, they were fortified and they were ready along the actual border, along the Western Front. And so Germany tried to go around the Western Front through Belgium. This created a crisis of a whole different kind. You see, Belgium had been created artificially. It was not a nation prior to the Napoleonic Wars. But to prevent further conflict, to ensure collective security, Belgium was created as a buffer state between the great powers of the West and the central powers in Central and Eastern Europe. So that the nation which went through tiny little Belgium would immediately become the bad guy and would bring the other Allied powers in. This actually brought Great Britain into the war. Like most wars, people thought it would be short and simple. Morale is high in the beginning of wars. I find that depressing. People typically believe that the war will last for a short time and we'll all be home by Christmas. The Germans believed this. The British and French believed this. Everybody just thought this would be a quick conflict, that their side would win, and they'd be home to brag about it. Teddy Roosevelt even called the Spanish-American War a splendid little war. It was the perfect time frame. 6 months long, people got to pretend to be heroes, and then got to go home and brag about it for the rest of their lives. World War I proved to be much different. And the first proof of this was the first major engagement, called the First Battle of the Marne. Germany took much longer than they had anticipated to go through the neutral country of Belgium. There were little traffic jams, there was small resistance, but enough to slow them down, annoying delays, which allowed the French time to prepare. And so they were waiting. And they managed to stop the German advance at this battle. This resulted in a stalemate, because at this point the French were dug in, charging against an entrenched enemy position, armed with artillery and barbed wire and landmines and machine guns, is suicidal. And so the Germans, with no better idea, simply dug in. And so you wind up with this line of trenches. Now in the East, we have a much different kind of war. You see, the Schlieffen Plan involved holding off Russia, using mainly Austrian troops, while focusing their full efforts on France. And it actually proved quite successful in the East. Traditional warfare was fought, battles, tactics, movements, engagements, etc. And Russia lost repeatedly. Russia was one of the slower countries to industrialize. And during this time of militarization, of the mobilization of armed forces, Russia was poorly equipped to deal with a modern war. They had lost just a few years prior to Japan. They had lost just a few years prior to China. And they had not been very successful in these modern war tactics. It was said they had only one gun for every 3 soldiers. back to the West for a moment. You know, if you decide to look at the YouTube version of this, I've got some movie clips that I'm going to put in, one of which is from Sergeant York. You'll get to see the over-the-top scene. Of course, you can just look it up on YouTube if you'd like. And the style of trench warfare that Hollywood portrayed, especially in the older films, was very sanitized. This is an actual photograph from the Battle of Ypres, where it rained for 30 days straight. We just came off a big rainy spell of about 7 days, 12 inches. This rained day and night for 30 days. We've already dried out. Trails are nice. I rode on them yesterday. People were drowning, literally drowning, in no man's land, falling into the mud under orders to charge. Bodies were left because it was unsafe to collect them. People were even engaging in cavalry charges across this no man's land. Of course, horses aren't going to be able to cross through that, and so there were even scattered corpses of horses. I wanted to show you another picture of the trenches. You know, again, when I think of trench warfare, and later in the war, they got a lot better. I would think of sophisticated networks with barbed wire and bunkers and reserve trenches and artillery and communication lines, men getting furlough, etc., leave time. These are some of the early trenches. Part of a soldier's standard issue equipment is a trench shovel. That is, if you start getting shot at, the best thing to do is to dig a hole in the ground and throw yourself in it. And that's what these men have done. So the years of the great slaughter. What you're looking at here is a scene from Legends of the Fall. Again, you can find this on YouTube, and I'll publish this later. And in this particular scene, their officer is going to stand out of the trenches. He's going to blow a whistle, and then he's going to kick a soccer ball. And the army would literally kick the soccer ball ahead, giving them something to focus on aside from the death. This is a collection of old tactics versus new technologies. See, the old tactics, like in the American Civil War, relied on heavy artillery to soften the enemy's lines and then a grand infantry assault to win the day. And in the old style of warfare, that was effective. The Civil War taught the stupidity of this tactic with the repeating rifle, with the exploding cannonballs, and then in the beginning, primitive versions of the machine gun. But these weapons have been greatly improved upon by the time of the First World War. These trenches were protected usually by 30 feet of entangled razor wire. Part of the purpose of these artillery barrages was to break holes in the barbed wire, allowing troops to charge into the breach. That's where that old saying comes from, charge into the breach. Usually didn't work. Artillery was very inaccurate. Even when it did land a direct hit on the barbed wire, it was usually pretty ineffective. Another piece of standard issue equipment for a World War I soldier is a pair of wire cutters. So you're supposed to stand there under sniper and machine gun and artillery fire and start cutting your way through the maze of barbed wire. That didn't prove too effective either. See, this style of warfare was different. For example, at the Battle of Verdun, 700,000 men died in a 6-month period. 700,000 died in a 6-month period. This was in 1916. the strategy of the German officer overseeing the Battle of Verdun was to, and I quote, bleed the French white. And he did. Meaning there was no particular important land that he hoped to gain from this. There was no strategic value to Verdun, except it did guard Paris. And the Frenchmen protecting this fort were told to put their backs to the wall and die for their country. And that was from the highest command. So the Germans achieved their goal. They did bleed the French white, because by the end of this battle, over 100,000 French soldiers left their post. There were mass hangings for desertion. You see, also in World War I, men signed up hoping to be heroes. You go into war thinking, I'm going to do something great for my country. And then more men died from artillery than from gunfire. It's the same sad story that we have in modern warfare. Young men, friends of mine, sign up wanting to be heroes, and then lose a limb to an IED, an improvised explosionary device. Never see the person who killed them. And it was the same. Poison gas was used for the first time in the First World War. The most famous of these was called mustard gas. Mustard gas attaches itself to moist parts of your body and causes blindness, causes extreme pain and irritation. It was just one of the types of gases. All of these gases usually were visible to the naked eye. Not all could be smelled, but usually they could be seen in the form of a vapor. And so soldiers had precious few seconds to prepare themselves. They trained for this. You see the gas, you put the mask on, you make sure it's sealed, you check your friends, they check you. Hopefully you survive this thing. They even had gas masks for horses, for dogs. And so the training was you get yourself safe and then those under your care safe. The soldiers had to deal constantly with the presence of death. For example, in the Battle of Verdun, over those terrible 6 months, the fighting became so bitter, snipers would pick off those who were sent to collect bodies. And so people soon learned that it was unsafe to go out to no man's land for any reason, even to collect the dead. So the dead were left to rot where they were. Rats grew to the size of dogs. The presence of crows was constant. It was terrible. Aaron Remarque, a veteran of the war, wrote his famous piece, All Quiet on the Western Front. And that phrase came to mean, and it was being used in the British High Command to refer to a day where less than 6,000 people lost their lives. Oh, there were less than 6,000 casualties today? All Quiet on the Western Front. And so that's where he got the name for his book. Again, I just wanted gas mask. In fact, a new genre of film came out after the First World War, horror movies. There was really no such thing as a horror film prior to the First World War. I think they had their inspiration. Now, that was the Western Front. That was part of the war. Another of the Central Powers were the Ottoman Empire. And it was believed among British intelligence that uprisings could be staged within the empire, that an Arab revolution against the Turkish rulers. You see, the Ottomans were Turks. That's an ethnic group. They make up the nation of Turkey today. However, of course, the people of Arab ethnicity, well, that's a great distinction. Arabs include the nations of Iraq, from Palestine, from Saudi Arabia, people of Arabic ethnicity. To be distinct, I guess is the point, from the Turks. And so a British officer named T.E. Lawrence, came to be known as Lawrence of Arabia, was sent to Saudi Arabia to start these revolutions. There's a neat movie about it you can see. As I mentioned before class, colonial subjects were caught up in the war. And I just finished reading Heart of Darkness. You got to check it out. You do. It's a really good book. It's very short. The audiobook was less than 5 hours long. So it's certainly worth picking up. If nothing else, watch the Apocalypse Now, the modern kind of version of Heart of Darkness. But the point is that these colonial peoples in Africa were caught up in the war as well. The war bled over into the African continent, just like in the French and Indian War, how it had bled over into the English colonies in what is today the United States. But what's very odd is that these African subjects were also sent to the trenches in Europe. There were Maasai warriors from Africa. There were Aboriginal warriors from Australia. There were people from all over the world that were brought to Europe to fight in this conflict, making it a true global conflict. Now, the United States got involved in 1917, and why? So, in 1917, the United States had decided to begin selling goods to Britain and France. In the beginning of the war, they had sold to Britain and Germany. But the British had put a blockade along the North Sea, the Germans' only access to the ocean. And so they had a blockade of ships, keeping goods coming in or out of the country, period. And they reserved the right to stop or turn around any ship coming to Germany. This created a famine in Germany. This led to the starvation of 700,000 German civilians. Starvation of 700,000. Now, in response to this, the Germans rolled out a new weapon, the undersea boot, or the U-boat, or the submarine. Could go under the British blockade. At this time, there was no technology that could detect them. They were essentially invisible. And they declared unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning they would set up a counter-blockade. If Britain was going to starve Germany out of the war, Germany was going to starve Britain out of the war. And so any ship bound for British harbors under these new guidelines could be sunk. This is the Lusitania, or it was. And this is a drawing. You know, I wish we had a photograph showing the German sub and people escaping and this were accurate, but it's a piece of propaganda. It was meant to fuel patriotic anger against the Germans. You see, this was actually a cruise ship. My wife and I went on a cruise this summer, and it was nice. You know, you sit there, you eat good food, exercise or whatever, but mainly you just relax. And never once did I think about anything bad happening to us. It was actually kind of a time to just rest. But these people, and there were 300 Americans on this cruise ship, were going to Britain. Now, I don't think this would be the time where my wife and I would choose to go take a cruise to a nation at war. You know, that doesn't sound relaxing to me. I'm not interested in visiting Syria at this time. I'm just not. You know, that is not a vacation. But these people did. There were 300 Americans and a number of British subjects, French, or people all over the world on this ship. What the Germans claimed is that the British were being sneaky and putting weapons and munitions and war-related goods in the hold of the ship. But nonetheless, this policy of unrestricted submarine warfare meant the Germans regarded that they had the right to sink any ship going into Britain. And there were several of these cases. This is just the most famous, the Lusitania, where ships with American civilians on board were sunk. Now, let's talk about the impact of war. Because, don't let me confuse you, this is a total war. And what total war means, everyone is involved. The leaders of these nations viewed their entire country's subjects as participants in this war. Civilians had to be involved in rationing, in working, in industries related to the war effort. Everyone had to do their part. Millions of people were being conscripted, meaning forced into the war itself. The war resulted in a real centralized control of economies. If you ever want to trace and understand why our government is so big, well, there was no such thing as an income tax prior to the Civil War. During times of war, governments exert greater control than they ever do in times of peace, and even over economies. You know, if you fear government control of an economy, then you need to vote for candidates that don't want to go to war. Because, for example, this central control of economies means that capitalist systems tended to be shelved. And the difference between soldiers at war and civilians at home became narrowed. People could be drafted into war-related industries, meaning you will work this job. President Truman even threatened to draft striking workers into the Korean War. And he ended a strike that way. He had that much power as president that he could say, if you do not work, I'm going to throw you in front of machine guns over here. And he had that power. Now, we're about to look at several pieces of propaganda. But you're exposed to propaganda daily, no matter what form of media you consume, be it social media or more conventional media on television. This one is simply from the U.S. Food Administration from the First World War, encouraging Americans to eat more of certain types of foods and eat less of other types of foods. Why? Because these types of foods, these non-perishables, could be packaged and sent overseas to help in the war effort. Because you see, in a total war, the government has to exert a greater deal of control over its citizens than it would in peacetime. Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, in 1917, argued that we must enter this war, and I quote, to make the world safe for democracy. Now, the irony is that in order to protect democracy, we had to break some rules. We had to, I can't think of how to say it, we had to go against democracy. So to protect democracy, we had to end democracy. At least was the understanding. Now, in the beginning of a war, and you guys were young when the last one started, I remember clearly, morale was high. Country music legends were making millions off songs about the war. Whiskey for our men, beer for our horses. Dixie chicks were being lynched and ridiculed for criticizing the war. And then where were we in 2008? Oh yeah, a president promised he would end the war and he got elected. So that's how wars affect public opinion. But during wars, governments tend to exert control over public opinion through the use of propaganda. You see, they have to maintain morale. Now, how do you do that? You got a couple ways. You've got positive control through propaganda, showing people patriotic images, decorating war heroes and sending them on speaking tours. And then you have negative control or censorship. The Alien and Sedition Acts, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, the Patriot Act, Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus. Long story short, the government, even the U.S. government, has a long history of censoring dissent. See, Bernie Sanders is running as a democratic socialist. He's not the first to do so. Eugene Debs was thrown in prison for criticizing the draft in the First World War. Won 10% of the popular vote while running from prison for criticizing this war as a simple means to promote U.S. imperialism abroad. Another neat thing about war, I guess neat is the wrong word, but another interesting fact about war is it tends to create opportunity for underrepresented groups. In this case, women wound up getting the vote because of the First World War in both the United States and Europe. Women were given opportunities in industry that had not been previously afforded to them. But of course, the sad part of that story is that after the war was over, many of these women lost their jobs as men would return to take them. Now, the vote, by 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed, the movement to get the right to vote had already been going on for 72 years. So it's not just like suddenly somebody said, hey, let's give women the right to vote. They worked really hard in this war. It's just that finally public opinion, because of the war effort, had moved enough in that direction to allow the passage.
Even as we grasp at victory, there is a cancer, an evil tumor, growing, spreading in our midst. Shout! Shout! Shout out his name!
Back to propaganda. Here you see Uncle Sam stomping out the Hun. Stomp, stomp, stomp. You know, these are German helmets. You see images like this all over the country. Remember the flag of liberty. And forget the part that if you criticize the war, we'll throw you in prison. There was another case of a movie being made about the American Revolution by D.W. Griffith. And he was actually told to stop producing the film because it showed the British as enemies, and they were our allies during the war. And so he had to stop making the movie. Censorship was common, not just in other countries, but ours as well. Propaganda was ever present. Like this image saying, "Defeat the Kaiser and his U-boats." And if you look at the image of the German soldier, the nose is elongated, the horn on the head, the eyes are squinted, the facial features look demonic. And then, of course, you have the Lusitania sinking in the background. Now, of all the nations that fared terribly in this war, Russia saw the worst of it. As I said, they only had one weapon for every 3 soldiers. They lost millions of people in this war, more so than any other nation. In March of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution took place. This is known as the March Revolution. The Tsar and his family were murdered, and a new government, a provisional government, was set up in its stead. Tsar Nicholas II was an autocratic ruler. That means he maintained absolute power over the government as well as the military. But the First World War and its major embarrassment for Russia magnified the problems going on in his own country. And so it began with a series of strikes of people refusing to work in the former city of St. Petersburg. People had been standing in bread lines every day. Many of these same people were women who had just finished 12-hour shifts in factories and now had to stand in bread lines for their food because even working people couldn't afford to eat. One police report stated, and I quote, "Mothers of families exhausted by endless standing in line at stores, distraught over their half-starving and sick children, are today perhaps closer to revolution than the liberal opposition leaders, and of course they are a great deal more dangerous because they are the combustive material for which only a single spark is needed to burst into flame." What they're arguing is this revolution was not fomented by the elites. This was not a case of Simon Bolivar in Argentina. This was a case of the poor taking matters into their own hands under the leadership of this provisional government. Now, the provisional government was led by a man named Alexander Kerensky, and the goal of the group that would become the Soviets was to first end the war. To end the war. This is what rallied the people. The war had created so much suffering and death for the Russian people, they were willing to kill their own leaders to end the war. And this is where Vladimir Lenin took power. And he was the leader of a small faction of Russian social democrats. And they were dedicated to implementing Marxist policies in Russia. Now, if you remember when we studied Karl Marx, the first step of creating a Marxist utopia is a violent revolution killing those opposed to the idea. And Lenin believed this, heart and soul. He believed that only a revolution, only violence could truly destroy the capitalist system. And it would take a well-disciplined professional group of revolutionaries to accomplish this. Now, like I said, the way that Lenin rallied the people was peace. And even though peace meant humiliation and the surrender of large amounts of territory, there really was no choice, because this is what rallied the people, was an end to the war itself. And so on March 3rd of 1918, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, and this gave up control of eastern Poland, of the Ukraine, and the Baltic provinces. So you may remember the war that Russia had against Ukraine called the Second Crimean War. It was just a year or so ago. And Russia claimed they were simply retaking a former territory. This is where they lost the territory. It was during the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, once the Tsar and his family were killed, and once Lenin had rallied the Russian people and ended the war, at least for them, it was going to go on for several more months with the rest of the nations. But Lenin was focused on dealing with matters in his own country. For one, there were quite a few people opposed to the idea of communism in Russia. These people called themselves the Whites. And many of these people had been loyal to the Tsar. Many of them had also been from the wealthy class. And they were essentially opposed to Lenin's radical ideas. In addition, Allied troops were sent to Russia to help the Whites regain power and to stop the communist revolution. Now, between 1918 and 1921, the Russian Civil War was taking place. And during this time, the white forces were defeated, and the the Reds, which were the communists, which were much more organized, eventually won. Now, the odd thing about this is that the whites were more powerful. They had support of the Allied powers. They had the wealth. Many of them were from the wealthy class themselves. So how is it that the Bolsheviks overcame overwhelming odds? And part of this goes to Leon Trotsky. Now, Trotsky was an organizational genius. He was the Commissar of War. He reinstated a draft of all territories which were under the control of the Reds. Able-bodied men would become soldiers in the new communist regime. Any who deserted or refused to obey orders would be executed immediately. Meanwhile, the whites, that is the anti-communists, were very disunified. There were a multitude of political differences. Though they agreed in opposing communism, there were some that had been previously loyal to the Tsar. There were some that wanted changes, but not to the radical degree of the Leninist. And this made it virtually impossible, because without a common goal, they fell apart. And the war on communism was turning in the tide of the communists in this case. Now, the first real system set up was called war communism. And that means that first, collectivization would be set up, meaning that the government would control industry and economy, but that the main priority would be to ensure resources for the Red Army. This included the nationalization of banks as well as most industries. This included a forced requisition of grain and war-related resources, and that the Bolsheviks would control all matters of the state. Another instrument of the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, what we're talking about here is a revolution of the largest country on the planet. That a minority of individuals led a revolution which changed this country forever. Now, another tactic they used was called revolutionary terror, and that was the use of secret police. These were called the Cheka, and their goal was to eliminate anyone who was opposed to the regime. Finally, the Allies were sending foreign troops to Russia to try to stop the communist revolution. And the intervention of these foreign armies enabled the communists to appeal to the sense of Russian patriotism. You know, what would have happened? Did you know that the British almost sent troops to the American South during the Civil War to help the Confederates? They were considering it. And there was a case where 2 Confederate diplomats were headed towards Britain on a boat to negotiate a possible alliance because Britain relied on the South's cotton. These 2 diplomats were picked up by a U.S. warship and taken prisoner, and Britain threatened to go to war over the capture of these diplomats who were flying under a flag of diplomacy. What if Britain had sent troops to the South? What would our country be like today? It's another one of those what ifs. In this case, because the Allied troops did send soldiers to fight against the communists, it actually helped the communists to rally local support out of a sense of Russian patriotism. At one point, there were more than 100,000 soldiers, mostly Japanese, British, American, and French, stationed on Russian soil. And so because of this, the communist government was able to again appeal to patriotism. By 1921, the communists were in complete control of Russia. Now, throughout the course of the Civil War, the communist regime had transformed Russia into a single-party, centralized state, hostile to the Allied powers, because it was the Allies who had worked against them during the war. And so from the very beginning of the Communist Revolution, there was a real sense of hostility between the Communists and the West. And I want you to understand that, because that is going to play a big role in how the Second World War plays out, and the non-aggression pact signed between Stalin and Hitler, and the later Cold War, because we never trusted Stalin with knowledge of the atomic bomb. We never sent troops to help Stalin fight against the Nazis when the Russians lost more than any other country in the Second World War as well. We refused to send troops. We even delayed the attack into Italy because we didn't care about Russian losses. And so there was always a sense of hostility between the Allied powers and then Russia, which was seen as separate. In fact, after the war was over, Russia was not allowed to have any part in the discussions in the formation of the Treaty of Versailles. And they wound up losing more territory than Germany or any other nation. All right, so World War today, and in particular we're going to be talking about the end of the First World War today and the ramifications of that. I think it's an important subject. It's one that doesn't get enough attention. While World War II is in color and you can watch Nazi zombies on Call of Duty, often people forget about the First World War. However, I think it deserves a lot more attention than it gets. Some people call the 20th century the Second 100 Years' War, and this would certainly be the first major outbreak of that long-standing conflict. But today we're going to focus on the last year of the First World War. By this time, the United States has entered the war. You can watch the video for the first part to learn about why. Germany's on the point of exhaustion. The war has been going on for 4 long years. Roughly 11 million soldiers perished in this war, as many civilians, in fact. So around 22 million total died as a direct result of the war, and then around 30 more million died from the influenza, the Spanish influenza that spread after the war, much of it brought home from soldiers in trenches. And so as we finalize the war, I just want you to understand that it is Great Britain and France and the United States as well as Russia pitted against Germany, Austria-Hungary, what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is their last years of that, and the Ottoman Empire. They will also collapse as a result of this war. And it's a world conflict because, like we've been discussing in this course, those nations had brought with them colonial peoples. They had required these colonial subjects to go into the war. And so we actually have Aborigines from Australia conscripted and fighting in the trenches. We have Indian Burkas fighting in the trenches. People from all over the world, because of colonialism, were brought into this conflict. But after 4 long years of total war, really, that means each nation throwing everything they had at each other, they were exhausted. Britain had reached the point of lowering height and weight requirements of soldiers, accepting soldiers in poor medical condition, accepting whoever they could get to go to the front lines. An entire generation of Western Europe's young people had been wiped out by this point. Germany did, however, have one advantage by 1918. That is that Russia had dropped out of the war. The Russians dropped out of the war after the Bolshevik Revolution. Russia was in the process of transitioning towards communism. And with the withdrawal of Russia, who, by the way, fielded more soldiers in this war than any other country, it represented a great opportunity for Germany and a renewed hope for victory. Now, at this time, Erich von Ludendorff had been guiding German military operations and had persuaded the German leaders to make one final military gamble. And really the war came down to this moment. And it was going to be a grand offensive across the Western Front. Now, by this time, the Western Front had stagnated, had not moved significantly since the spring of 1914, the summer of 1914, where in the First Battle of the Marne, the French rallied to stop the German offensive, and then for 4 long years, armies would try to break each other's lines with frontal assaults after frontal assaults. And they would break each other on these lines, dying by the millions. It was an awful, awful way to fight a war. But again, the war came down to this moment in 1918. where the Germans were going to try everything. And so the Great Attack was launched in March of 1918 and lasted a couple of months and ended by July. But by this time, 140,000 American troops, really in total about 3 million American troops, had been sent overseas to fight in this war. But in this particular battle, there were 140,000 American troops to provide reinforcements to the French and British, who were exhausted at this time, who were able to turn back the Germans. This is known as the Second Battle of the Marne, and it concluded on July 18th. And so this final gamble for the German Empire was a colossal failure. And so as a result, after this last battle, Germany signed an armistice, and this would end the First World War. Now, an armistice simply means an end to the fighting. It doesn't mean total peace. It doesn't mean unconditional surrender. Now, the Allied powers in the Second World War decided they would only accept the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich. And, of course, that ended with Hitler's death, and then the Nazis surrendered unconditionally, which led to the occupation of Germany and then Japan for about almost 50 years. In this case, however, Germany signed an armistice, which is essentially a stalemate. On September 29th of 1918, General Ludendorff informed the German leaders that the war was lost and insisted that the government sue for peace at once. Now, initially, the Allied powers were unwilling to make peace with an autocratic government. They didn't want to acknowledge and publicly accept the existence of an autocratic form of government. They wanted Germany to reform its government. So effectively, what began was the process of negotiating an armistice. And that's what this was a negotiated peace. Germany agreed to reform its government and become more democratic. The Allied powers agreed to withdraw their forces. And on November 11th, at the 11th hour of the 11th month in 1918, armistice was signed. It's forever now memorialized as Veterans Day. And this is celebrated and recognized throughout the world as Armistice Day as well. Now, roughly 8 or 9 million people were killed in combat. World War I devastated the European population. Roughly between 8 and 9 million soldiers died on the battlefields. Another 22 million were wounded. And as many, at least, civilians perished as well. Now, many of those who survived the war later died of injuries. It was not uncommon for bullet wounds to result in amputation, so there were millions of amputees among the survivors. In fact, this had a devastating impact on the entire continent of Europe. The birth rate in many European countries declined noticeably after the death or maiming of so many young men. World War I also created a lost generation. It had a profound cultural impact in a lot of ways. For some, the familiarity with violence and war is going to make the idea of fascism more tolerable. For many, the war would be a complete collapse of their faith. In fact, church membership declined significantly after the war. And in many ways, Western Europe became more secular after the First World War was over. Now, the killing did not only affect soldiers. As I said, untold numbers of civilians died from war injuries or starvation. In 1915, using the excuse of a rebellion by the Armenian minority and their supposed collaboration with Russians, the Turkish government began to systematically kill Armenian men and then expel women and children from the nation altogether. This was known as the Armenian Genocide, followed actually coincided with the First World War. Within 7 months, 600,000 Armenians were killed, and 500,000 more had been forcibly deported from the country. Of those who were deported, 400,000 died while marching through the deserts and swamps of Syria. So there was an Armenian refugee crisis in 1915. No one wanted these refugees, not too dissimilar to what we've been seeing in the news. And by 1915, an estimated 1 million Armenians were dead, victims of a genocide. Next, I wanted to show you a clip from the Brainerd Daily Dispatch. Headlines like this were common all around the world. Armistice declared. Germany surrenders. And you see that on November 11th, the government officially announced the signing of the armistice. The draft was canceled, and all around the world there was rejoicing. But the story's not over yet. Now, one thing I want to point out here is arguably the First World War led directly into the Second World War. And for reasons that we're going to... President Woodrow Wilson hoped that this would be the war to end all wars, or the Great War, as they called it. He hoped, and perhaps he truly believed, that when he gave the order to send our troops overseas, he announced publicly the purpose was to make the world safe for democracy. And I think he lived up to this ideal with his post-war plan called the 14 Points. And I'm going to highlight some of these points for you. It was his 14 Points plan that Woodrow Wilson became very famous for around the world. In fact, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize for it. He's one of only 3 presidents in American history to have received the Nobel Peace Prize. It was his plan to prevent future wars. Nobody listened to it. They gave him a big shiny medal, one of the best medals that you can get, but nobody listened. Now, his plan was based on several principles. Number one, open diplomacy. In January of 1919, delegations of 27 victorious Allied nations gathered in Paris to conclude the final settlement that would officially end this war. So even though the armistice had been declared in 1918, the details of negotiating a true peace were yet to be determined. And over a period of years, the reasons for fighting the war had been transformed from the selfish nationalistic principles of competition and greatness to a need and desire to prevent such a tragedy. All nations involved realized how terrible this conflict was. War was once viewed as a glorious thing, but not by those who have fought in it. But war has often been romanticized in literature, but the reality of it is terrible. And World War I might be one of the most terrible conflicts that we've ever seen, for reasons that you'll see in the beginning part of the chapter. And nations, entire nations involved, wanted desperately to ensure that nothing like this happens ever again. Really, the devil was in the details. Everyone could agree that this needed to never happen again. But then guess what? We have an even larger war just 20 years later, because no one listened to Wilson's ideas. But these principles that the nations soon came to realize throughout the course of the war could perhaps best be personified by Wilson's 14 points. Wilson's proposals for a truly just and lasting peace included, quote, open covenants of peace, openly arrived at. The idea here was open treaties, open diplomacy, instead of secret alliances. instead of militarization. You see, there was a long arms race leading up to the First World War. At the beginning of the chapter, you'll learn about how the war was begun because of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But you'll also learn about how so many horrible big things were going on leading up to this conflict. But Wilson's idea here is brilliant. And then finally, the self-determination of people, so that, quote, all well-defined national aspirations shall be accorded to the utmost satisfaction. See, one of the big problems here, like we were discussing last week, is that many governments only wanted to be liberal in theory. They only wanted to appear democratic. They didn't want to actually allow the self-determination that we talked about with John Locke. They didn't actually want to allow people to be free. And what Wilson's idea was based on, if we could truly allow self-determination of peoples, we would eliminate many of the needs and causes of wars. But what does self-determination mean? Now, as the spokesman for a new world order, which is what Wilson was really proposing here, based on democracy and international cooperation, Wilson was enthusiastically cheered. He was called a hero. Again, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize for this. By the way, Alfred Nobel was the man who invented dynamite. He forever regretted his decision, and he created the Nobel Peace Prize with the wealth he gained from dynamite to recognize people who sought to advance the cause of world peace. And here was a leader, the leader of the most powerful nation in the world, who truly believed in a way to make this happen. And he was cheered. He was. People loved it. In theory. Now, Wilson's rhetoric on self-determination also inspired people in the colonial world, in Africa, in Asia, and the Middle East. Really, following the First World War, we see numerous anti-colonial movements. You see, Wilson's message, though it was not well received, as we'll see in a moment, was inspirational to many. Because you see, when we talked about the carving up of Africa, we were talking about the rape and the genocide and the exploitation of peoples for selfish gain. You know, and it should upset you to think about that. But here again is this opportunity for people to begin to correct that problem. Now, Wilson found, however, that more practical motives than idealism guided the other great nations at the Paris Peace Conference. You see, these secret treaties and agreements that had tied these nations together prior to the war could not be completely ignored. Alliances had been made and had been sealed in blood, even if they did conflict with the principle of self-determination that Wilson had spoke of. National interest also complicated things. For example, David Lloyd George, who was the current Prime Minister of Great Britain at that time, had won his election to Prime Minister, a national election, the only national election in Great Britain, had won, and his campaign promise was, make Germany pay. That's what people had elected him for. So I want you to understand that Wilson had this neat idea, but no one bothered to listen. Perhaps it was because America suffered to a lesser degree than the European nations. While we lost many, we didn't lose all. France's approach to peace was primarily determined by a need to consider national security. You see, hugging and shaking hands and making peace is good in theory, but France sits right on the border with Germany, a nation that had just invaded them for 4 long years. And what France was concerned about was seeing that this did not happen again. Now, the Premier of France, Georges Clemenceau, had led his country to victory. But the French had bore the worst of it. Most of the wars had been fought on their soil. And they felt they deserved revenge. And they felt they deserved assurance to prevent future aggressions. At the end of the day, Woodrow Wilson is going to concede all of his 14 points, except for the final one. He was willing to give up the idea of self-determination, of open diplomacy, of a reduction in arms, of all of these high-minded ideals to get the world's first organization of its kind, the League of Nations, the world's first international organization, did result in this war. Now, it did take America's willingness to concede on all of the other points. And in fact, we had to accept the eventuality that the old way of fighting was still going to continue. That territory exchanged hands, that Germany was broken up, that Germany was forced to actually pay a large financial sum to the other Allied powers as compensation for the war. And so revenge became the deciding factor here. And this is known as the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles contained within it a war guilt clause. You see, Germany had to admit, though the fault was really bigger than just them, but they were forced to admit in writing that it was their sole responsibility. Even though that's not fair, it's really more complicated than that. But they were forced to admit they were wrong. Germany was limited to an army of 100,000 men. They had to cut back their navy. They had to eliminate entirely their air force. And they were forced to give up many of the territories that they had claimed through decades and centuries of warfare. For example, one that hurt them the most was the Alsace-Lorraine along the border of Germany and France. In fact, that's going to be the very first place that the Nazis will take back throughout the 1930s. Now, Germany wound up having to give up much of their territory, including their colonial possessions. And these would be handed over to the Allied powers, who would make financial gain of them. The Treaty of Versailles also mandated the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many of their territories and colonies again would be handed over to the Allied powers. This is extremely significant because I don't know if you've ever looked at a map of the Ottoman Empire, but when it came to an end as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, the modern Middle East was created. You see, the Ottoman Empire represented the very last time in history where the Middle East was united under the leadership of the Ottoman Turks, who had conquered them. And when Great Britain, under the leadership of Winston Churchill, drew the new map of the Middle East, let's be honest, he made a mess of it. Much of the conflict in the Middle East results from ethnic tensions because of poorly drawn national lines. Had self-determination been allowed to take its natural course, then the Kurdish people in northern Iraq would have chosen to separate from the Sunnis in the main part of Iraq. Again, ethnic groups perhaps would have divided, perhaps would have chosen among themselves to unite into a people. We don't know. We may never know because a colonial power told them who they were and told them the borders of their countries. And it didn't work out so well, as we know. Now, as I said previously, Wilson was willing to concede on all other ideas to get the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations represented the first attempt in the history of our planet to have a truly international organization where grievances could be aired publicly by representatives of each respective country, and these things could be handled peacefully by diplomats through negotiation and compromise. That was the idea of the League of Nations. However, it was unfortunately ineffective. You see, President Woodrow Wilson recognized that these treaties, like the Treaty of Versailles, contained several unwise provisions that could cause future conflicts. For example, the reparations that Germany was forced to pay, $15 billion. I don't know how to convert that into today's money, or at least I haven't. I'm sure it could be. It's a staggering sum in 1918 dollars. In fact, it collapsed Germany's economy trying to pay these war reparations. It almost led to the Second World War 2 decades early because of Germany's inability to make payments to France and Great Britain, and these two countries prepared to invade Germany because they had reneged on the deal. Now, meanwhile, the League of Nations attempted to outlaw war forever, if that's even a thing. They passed the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Nations around the world signed a document promising an end to war as a means of aggression. They all signed it. It's called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And they all cheered and they all said, "Yay, we've ended war." But there was no way to enforce it. You see, the League of Nations could pass international law that had the effect of law, but there was no executive branch of the world to enforce it. There was no way to enforce international law without the willing participation of the members. And so really we have the same problem in the League of Nations that we had in the Articles of Confederation in the United States prior to the signing of the Constitution. But these reparation payments are really a sticky point for German citizens between World War I and World War II. France's search for security, meanwhile, their feeling of safety and stability, relied on strict enforcement of the Treaty of Versailles. This began with the issue of reparations, these payments that the Germans were supposed to make to compensate financially the damages they had caused by the war. And I actually spoke incorrectly. 132 billion marks, German form of currency, were to be paid. That's $33 billion for money of that time. And the German Republic made its first payment in 1921, but because of financial troubles, I mean, think of how much war costs. Because of financial troubles that the German economy was experiencing, they were only able to make that first payment. And so, as I said, the French government threatened to invade, and were it not for the Dawes Plan in August of 1924, perhaps World War II would have started in 1924. Now, arguably, it could have been a smaller affair. It could have been yet another war, and it could have made the Second World War worse. Again, we don't know. But the United States actually agreed to front Germany the money. They floated Germany the amount of the payment that was due, and they forwarded that payment to France to prevent France from invading. In 1925, the Treaty of Locarno was signed. In the 1920s, there was a time of unprecedented economic prosperity. And with prosperity often comes peace, if there's no need for war. And so in this spirit of cooperation that was fostered by foreign ministers of Germany and France, in the signing of the Treaty of Locarno, the hope here was that there would be a European peace, a new era of European peace. Now, Germany really lacked the military power to alter their borders, even if they wanted to. And so in reality, the signing of the Treaty of Locarno was Germany's only option. They agreed to a reduction in their borders. They agreed to make peaceful arrangements with these European countries, but they had no other choice. They were limited to a standing army of 100,000 soldiers, which was nothing compared to the other nations of that time. Germany had been disarmed. However, Germany had also expected that the other nations would comply with the 14 points, which mandated international disarmament. But of course, these nations were unwilling to. And though there were numerous disarmament conferences to follow, no countries ever willingly gave up their substantial militaries. But of all the things that led to the Second World War and the rise of fascism, perhaps the Great Depression was the biggest underlying cause. You see, in times of prosperity, nations have no need to fight one another. But because of the Great Depression, which was experienced around the world, there were political repercussions. Because when people become desperate and when they're starving, they can't afford the luxuries of democracy and peace. Because in desperation, people turn to dictators to fix their problems. And so later we'll be talking about the rise of fascism. And in large part due to the economic collapse of many Western European countries. Because you see, after the First World War, Western European nations, the United States, and around the world began to go through a period of serious economic difficulties. For example, during the war, Great Britain had lost many of its markets for industrial products, especially the United States and Japan. The post-war decline of staple industries such as coal, steel, and textiles felt around the world led to a rise in unemployment. And Britain faced the growing effects of the Great Depression. National government claimed credit for bringing Britain out of the worst stages of the Depression, primarily by using traditional policies of balanced budgets as well as protective tariffs. British politicians largely ignored the ideas of a Cambridge economist who published his General Theory of Employment and Interest in Money in 1936. Keynes, known for Keynesian economics, condemned the traditional view that in a free economy, depressions should be left to work themselves out. Keynes argued, and this is now the liberal economic theory, that unemployment stemmed not from overproduction, but from a decline in demand, and maintained that demand could be increased by putting people back to work, constructing highways and public buildings, even if governments had to go in debt through deficit spending. I mean, how many liberal politicians have you heard paraphrase that exact passage of Keynesian economic theory? It's the idea that deficit spending can stimulate an economy to pull us out of a financial depression. Now, meanwhile, on to Soviet Russia. The Civil War in Russia, which began with the Bolshevik Revolution, took an enormous toll of life. Vladimir Lenin, who instigated this, had pursued a policy of war communism. But once the war was over, peasants began to sabotage the program by hoarding food. Added to this problem was a terrible drought, like the Dust Bowl, which caused a famine and claimed as many as 5 million lives in Russia at this time. In fact, an industrial collapse paralleled this agricultural disaster. By 1921, industrial output was only 20% of its 1913 levels. Russia as a nation was exhausted. One peasant banner proclaimed, "Down with Lenin and horse flesh. Bring back the Tsar, and pork. As I said, people turn to dictators when they are desperate and starving. High-minded ideals like self-determination and open diplomacy and mutual prosperity work well when there's plenty. When there is not plenty, down with linen and horseflesh, bring back the Tsar and pork. As Leon Trotsky said, allied to Vladimir Lenin, quote, "The country and the government with it were at the very edge of the abyss." And so in March 1921, Lenin pulled Russia back from the abyss by adopting his new economic policy. This was a modified version of the old capitalist system. Peasants would be allowed to sell their produce openly. Retail stores and small industries that employed fewer than 20 employees could now operate under private ownership, although heavy industry, banking, and the mines remained in the hands of the government. In 1922, Lenin and the Communists formally created a state called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, known as the USSR. Already by that same year, a revived market and a good harvest had brought the famine to an end. Soviet agricultural production climbed to 75% of its pre-war level. Now, Lenin died in 1924, and this inaugurated a new struggle for power. Among the 7 members of the Politburo, the institution that became the leading organ of the Communist Party in Russia. The Politburo was divided over the future direction of the country. Those on the left, the more liberals, led by Leon Trotsky, wanted to end the new economic policy. And they wanted to launch Russia on a path of rapid industrialization. Another group, called the right, rejected the cause of world revolution and wanted instead to focus on their own country. Now, Joseph Stalin wound up winning this battle, as I'm sure you're all aware of. And these ideological divisions were underscored by an intense personal rivalry between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. In 1924, Trotsky held the post of Commissar of War and was the leading spokesman for the Politburo, the small council that led Russia. Stalin was content to hold the job of party general secretary, while other members held party positions that enabled them to display their speaking abilities and gain fame for themselves. But Stalin was skillful at avoiding allegiance to either faction of the party. He was also a good organizer and used his post to eventually gain complete control of the Communist Party when Trotsky was expelled in 1927. By 1929, Stalin had succeeded in eliminating the Bolsheviks of the revolutionary era and had established a dictatorship. And so now we're going to briefly talk about cultural trends in this point in European history. The enormous suffering and the deaths of almost 10 million people during the Great War had shaken society to its foundations. As they tried to rebuild their lives, Europeans wondered often what had gone wrong with Western civilization. The Great Depression only added to the desolation left behind by the war. Now, political and economic uncertainties were paralleled by social innovations. The Great War had served to break down many traditional middle-class attitudes, especially those towards sexuality. In the 1920s, women's physical appearance changed dramatically. Short skirts, short hair, the use of cosmetics that were once thought to be the preserve of prostitutes, and the new practice of suntanning gave women a new image. This change in physical appearance, which stressed more exposure of a woman's body, was also accompanied by frank discussions of sexual matters. See, in 1926, a Dutch physician, Theodore von Velde, published a book called Ideal Marriage, Its Physiology and Technique, which became an international bestseller. In this book, he described the female and male anatomy at great depth, discussed birth control techniques, and glorified sexual pleasure within marriage. Now, uncertainty also pervaded the cultural and intellectual achievements of the post-war years. Artistic trends were largely a working out of implications of pre-war developments. Abstract painting, for example, became even more popular. In addition, pre-war fascination with the absurd and the unconscious content of the mind seemed more appropriate after the nightmare landscapes of the World War I battlefronts. This gave rise to both the Dada movement and Surrealism. Dadaism attempted to enshrine the purposelessness of life. Revolted by the insanity of life, the Dadaist tried to give it expression by creating anti-art. One example of this in 1918, Berlin Dada Manifesto maintained that, quote, Dada is the international expression of our times, the great rebellion of artistic movements. Many Dadaists assembled pieces of junk into collages, believing they were transforming their refuse into culture or art. Dada became an instrument to comment on women's roles as well as new mass culture. However, perhaps the most influential of the post-war artistic movements is Surrealism. Surrealism sought a reality beyond the material, sensible world and found it in the world of the unconscious through the portrayal of fantasies, dreams, or nightmares. Salvador Dali became one of the most famous workers of Surrealism. And Dali portrayed recognizable objects entirely divorced from their natural context. By placing objects into unrecognizable relationships, Dali created a disturbing world in which the irrational had become tangible. James Joyce and his famous work Ulysses in 1922 showed a great interest in the unconscious, evident in Surrealism. This was also apparent in the development of new literary techniques. One of the most apparent of these new literary techniques was a stream of consciousness. This was a technique in which a writer presents an interior monologue or a report of the innermost thoughts of each character. One example of this genre was written by the Irish exile James Joyce. His work Ulysses, published in 1922, told the story of one day in the life of ordinary people in Dublin by following the flow of their inner dialogue. A German writer, Hermann Hesse, dealt with the unconscious in a different fashion. His novels reflected the influence of new psychological theories, as well as Eastern religions, and focused on, among other things, the spiritual loneliness of modern human beings in a mechanized urban society. Hesse's novels made a large impact on Germany's youth in the 1920s. In fact, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature. But for most of the Western world, the best way to find escape was through mass entertainment. In fact, the 1930s represented a heyday in Hollywood when the single year of 1937 turned out nearly 600 feature films. Supplementing the movies were cheap paperback books and radio, which brought sports and soap operas and popular music to the masses. The increased size of audiences and the ability of radio cinema, unlike the printed work, to provide an immediate mass experience added a new dimension to mass culture. Favorite film actors and actresses became stars. Their lives became subject to public adoration and scrutiny. Sensuous actresses such as Marlene Dietrich, whose appearance in the early sound film Blue Angel catapulted her to fame and projected new images of women's sexuality. And I wanted to end here with a clip from the very first movie with sound. So this is called The Jazz Singer.